Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger at bloggingforjobs.com, for an in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, welcome your host, Jessica, with this podcast episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology podcast. Thank you for making us part of your week. Americans spend nearly 2 hours, that's 2 hours a day, on social media. It's an important part of our personal and professional lives. Today's topic is social media background checks and workplace investigations with my guest, Eli Rosenblatt. Eli is an investigator and digital forensic specialist located in Portland, Oregon. His caseload includes in-depth background investigations, social media, comprehensive workplace investigations, missing persons, criminal defense, civil, insurance, and family law. Welcome to the podcast, Eli.
Thanks so much, Jessica.
Is there anything I missed in that introduction that you wanted to talk about?
No, that covers it.
How did you get into social media and kind of this digital investigation space?
You know, having been a dedicated nerd for many years, I came into investigation not from law enforcement, as many of my colleagues came into it from. I came into it actually right out of college. I got a internship at a law firm in San Francisco, and I'd always been I never took computer science or got formal degree or training in that way, but I have been deeply ensconced in Macs and the more technical aspects of computers and the internet ever since that time in the early 90s. And investigating social media and social networks was sort of a natural outgrowth of my work as an investigator and as a forensic examiner.
It's totally fascinating to me. And I would like for you to kind of walk us through what a digital investigator is. And then
Sure.
How does this relate to social media in particular?
Yeah. So there's investigators like myself who sometimes wear different hats, or sometimes attorneys or HR folks will bring in multiple different kinds of people to fill different roles in an investigation. And digital investigations are what needs to happen in any sort of case these days, be it something that actually sees the light of a courtroom or something that's just handled in-house. These days there really has to be some sort of component to this work that involves digital evidence. And so when I talk about wearing different hats, I'm talking first about the workplace investigator, someone who does interviews, reviews documents, deals with financial information, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, a forensic examiner or forensic analyst, someone who's responsible for acquiring bit-for-bit copies, non-altering copies of all the relevant digital media involved, whether it's a computer, smartphone, USB backup drives, what have you, and analyzing all of that for particular content that's relevant to the investigation, which sometimes might include deleted files or other kinds of digital artifacts, be they audio, video, social media postings that are found online or just remnants of those that are found on a computer. So those different pieces of work might be taken on by totally different people, or in the case of a case I recently had, for instance, they might be taken on by one person wearing different hats. I had a case recently where someone was taking material, important data and client information with them when they left a company, and the investigation involved talking to the people surrounding them, looking at all of the digital artifacts to see what they had access to when and where that information might have gone. So that's kind of the broad brush of what digital investigations can involve in a workplace case.
And I think that most of us in human resources, unfortunately, have had to deal maybe with a scenario like you described, because digital information, computers, once that leaves the control of your office or VPN, it's hard to keep track of and know if your assets are secure.
Absolutely. And it's sometimes hard to know that even if it's totally in-house, even if you're not dealing with BYOD or bring your own device. Sometimes, excuse me, just trying to determine what someone had access to when. Um, and I should say that not all the types of cases that I've dealt with along these lines are people leaving the company with the goods. A lot of times it's involving harassment or embezzlement. Someone who in some sort of backdoor channel has access to information they shouldn't have, that kind of thing. So there's all different types of cases where you may need to bring in some sort of digital investigations.
Well, let's switch over to social media since that's the topic of our Workology podcast today. Let's talk a little bit about background checks and investigations in terms of employers looking into a candidate's or an employee's social media profiles. Are they allowed to do that? And if so, is there a limit to what we can and can have access to and use?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there's no simple answer to that question. Can they have access to a candidate's social media or a current employee's social media information? The cases that I've been involved with in one way or another have all shown me really clearly that there are some really thorny, difficult to navigate privacy issues. And there's a lot of case law around this that's developing in the last several years. My best experience on this issue tells me that it's really essential for any HR person or investigator to make sure that there's an attorney on board who can help them navigate that territory and who can help them understand what the issues are and help them steer clear of any, landmines or difficult places where they might be getting into a violation of an employee or a prospective employee's privacy. I've seen these kinds of investigations work well only when there's a real segregation of personnel. In other words, the hiring folks, the HR folks who are trying to determine if someone is the best candidate, might not do the social media searching themselves. Because a lot of times what you'll see on social media is content that will reveal information about a protected class. And that's, of course, something that all hiring folks are going to be very wary of, or need to be very wary of. So the way I've seen this work well in the past, and had other folks tell me about this in their direct experience, and in the cases that I've worked on as well, is that the HR folks or the hiring folks will give an investigator or give someone on their team a list of key terms or particular red flags to look for when they are researching these people online. And without giving the hiring folks all kinds of information about that, that's protected, they're only giving the information to the hiring folks that is relevant to whether or not this person is a good candidate. So you're looking for red flags about whether or not, for instance, this person works well with others, or has some sort of very obvious reason that they would not be able to do the job, that kind of thing. So the other thing I should say about that is that it's trickier territory when you're dealing with an employee who is not an executive at the executive level making 75 grand or over. Just in terms of the FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there's certain, and I should say other regulations, other laws, but there are certain things that are in place that make it so that when you are dealing with someone at 75K and above, those restrictions don't apply as much, and you can do a deeper sort of background investigation than you can otherwise.
I think it's important to note, and this comes from 2003, so the data is a little old, but this is from a Career Builder survey, and I'll have a link in the notes of the podcast. But it talks and says that 48% of employers are Googling candidates. So I definitely think that I agree with Eli and that it's important to maybe segregate or separate the process, and certainly use an attorney or some sort of expert who has a knowledge of state laws, because privacy laws and employment laws are different in every state. And then we have our good friends, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, where things are always shifting and changing, and we might not always be aware.
Indeed, indeed.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about employer investigations with regard to social media. What type of evidence do you recommend employers have on hand before terminating maybe an employee? I just kind of want to peel the layers back a little bit. Is it enough to have a tweet in hand? Do we need to maybe dig a little deeper? What do you recommend?
I think it depends to a certain extent, it depends on the case. If it's very simple and someone has, been violating company policy and has clearly, there's no dispute that this particular tweet or this particular posting on social media otherwise has somehow very clearly violated a clearly stated policy, then yeah, I don't think there's much more that you would need. That kind of case, though, I think is more rare these days. More often than not, you're dealing with multiple people and you're dealing with a more gray area about whether or not what they said online actually violates company policy or hurts the company in some way. So I think there's a couple of rules of thumb that I fall back on when I'm dealing with these kinds of investigations. And the first is that most often screenshots just won't cut it. It's a good way to get the process started is to just take a quick screenshot of what you're seeing. Most of the time, most of the kinds of cases that I've been on have needed more in-depth investigation than just simply grabbing one screenshot. You're very often dealing with multiple people, multiple postings on multiple sites, and you definitely need some kind of authentication of what's been posted. You got to be able to show clearly that this post was not generated by somebody else with an axe to grind. You need to be able to clearly show the breadcrumb trail that proves that this posting came from that person. This problematic posting came from the person you're saying it came from. Too many times now I've seen court cases where something is just thrown out for lack of proper authentication. So, and you may be able to do that in-house as an HR person, a senior HR person, or with an in-house investigator. But you may need to, especially if you're dealing with tons of digital evidence, or with a lot of different players, a lot of different witnesses, and a lot of different postings to different social media sites, you may need some sort of tool beyond just simple screen recording. Something that will help you index all those posts so you can search them by keyword and so forth. There are some good things. There's some good tools out there now. There didn't used to be when we were doing these investigations several years ago, but now there are some good tools. Things like X1 Social Discovery, which is not a simple, cheap, off-the-shelf piece of software, but is a kind of higher end solution for bigger companies. But it can really help you if you have a large case with lots of different people. It can really help you to narrow down exactly what someone was saying at a given time, and it can preserve all that information in a read-only way so that it can be used in a hearing or a court case or something.
Yeah, because social media isn't just tweets or Facebook posts. It's a lot of different types of mediums too.
Exactly.
Let's take up a bit of a reset here. I want people to be able to connect with you on Twitter in particular and other places. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic is social media workplace investigations and background checks with Eli Rosenblatt. You can connect with Eli on Twitter at PDXinvestigator. I would like to know about live streaming tools like Video and Blab and Periscope and podcast streaming tools like Zcast. How do these play into workplace social media situations, and what advice do you have for employers?
Well, I would say the first piece of advice that I have for employers is to do their best, and sometimes I'd say good luck, to stay up, to stay current on what all the tools are that are being used by their employees. May not be possible in all different cases, but these tools come and go so fast. Something that you didn't even know about yesterday all of a sudden is absolutely essential to your workplace and to investigations that you're conducting onto things that happen in the workplace. Similarly, tools that you relied on and that you thought were here to stay and that were essential might be totally gone tomorrow. So things are changing, things are shifting drastically and very quickly in this new landscape of social media and social media investigations. Blab and Periscope are two newer tools which themselves present different challenges for employers. They certainly present a lot of different advantages for folks wanting to do live streaming of their products or their new policies or what have you for their employers or for their customers. But for HR folks and for investigators, they present some interesting challenges because if things are said or things are talked about that are controversial or that are relevant to an investigation using one of these tools, you have to be careful about how that information is captured. For instance, on Periscope, the replay isn't for more than 24 hours. You can replay that information for up to 24 hours after the live stream, whereas for Blab, basically perpetually available. So capturing that content, again, making sure that you have it in a way that's authenticated is going to be essential. I think they call them scopes. For Periscopes, they're only available for 24 hours, whereas Blab doesn't appear to have any sort of time limit for the replay feature. So I would say that for any tool like this, you need to know ahead of time how the tools are being used by your people. What they're using them for, what kinds of content is going out there to your employees and to your customers, to your stakeholders, whether or not there's information on there that you need to manage or control, or be aware that it might need to be captured for future use.
The fact that Periscope and Scopes are only available for 24 hours really is forcing HR professionals, company leaders to really have a solid process in place to investigate these and move quickly.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's a difficult situation because you might go along thinking, oh, this is a cool new tool. And there's, nothing that could be better than to be able to live stream whatever kind of information we need to. And it's just another way that we can have people working remotely and people connect with each other, collaborate on things from various different locations. It's a great new tool. But with every new kind of tool, there comes the possibility that information shared using those tools will be threatening in some way to your operation or to your people. And so I always recommend that people are careful about and think strategically about how these new tools are implemented.
Do you think that the responsibility lies in finding out about these new tools with somebody in information technology or in human resources? You have an opinion either way?
I would say it's got to be both. I think that folks in HR and in IT have got to work together to decide what tools are going to best meet the company's needs without giving away the goods, without compromising the security practices that folks have already put in place. And there's a dance there. There's a back and forth that needs to happen. And I'm sure that many of your listeners have direct experience with this kind of push and pull where they have wanted to use some sort of new tool or some sort of new technology, and the folks who are dealing with security questions have said, well, hold on, let's make sure first that we can do this in a way that's going to be in line with the protocols we've set up to keep ourselves safe. So, I always recommend that folks bring on, if they don't have someone in house, that they bring on someone like a CISP, a Certified Information Systems Security Professional, CISSP, who can help folks put controls in place that can reduce the risk of someone taking data or clients with them or leaking information. Um, Social media investigations as well in the process of that can help determine who's saying what about the company. So it's kind of I would say it's a multi-pronged strategy, and you got to kind of, to deal with it well, you got to have all the players on board.
If you want your mind blown as far as like new tools out there, probably my favorite place to go for that is a website and community called Product Hunt. And you can literally spend hours just looking at all the new stuff that is in development or recently available, both enterprise and consumer level products. It's always sort of interesting and eye-opening.
Yeah, it's bonkers. I mean, just the number and the type of things that are coming out all the time. It's hard for folks to keep up with, for sure. And I don't envy people in HR these days, for the work that they have to do to determine whether or not something is going to work out for, it's going to be safe and useful for their company.
Well, you mentioned the Certified Information Systems Professional, or CISP. I also wonder if you had any suggestions for other ways that digital forensics and investigations can help reduce a business's risk.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of work that can be done on the front end when folks are being onboarded and when people are being trained, that can help to make sure information isn't going out the back door. There's a lot of things that can be done to help make sure that people are, first of all, just aware of what all the policies are. I think one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, what should employers be doing with regard to social media in-house along these lines? And I've never seen it work very well for folks to outright ban social media. I do think there are some higher security workplaces where there's a higher expectation, for instance, of more strictly clean computing experiences, the places where there's a lot more at stake, people's private information, really important information assets. But I think in most workplaces, banning, you just have to come up with some sort, on the front end, you have to come up with some sort of reasonable policies and reasonable protocols for how people can best connect to each other and have their personal social media experience without interfering with their work. Because I think banning it outright in many cases is just a recipe for disaster.
I'm in agreement with you on banning. It just, I think, is not reasonable unless you're in some sort of high security facility where everything is on lockdown. But if your employees, whether they're at work or at home, are spending 2 hours a day on social media, personally, I would rather have them aware of the policies and trained on how to properly use it, and know as employers how we're monitoring and watching that information to make sure that our company is protected.
Absolutely. And these days, the tools available, even for the small business, certainly at the enterprise level, but even for the small business, the tools available for managing the distinct sides of someone's work, making a firewall between the personal and the professional, are much better than they used to be. Those tools have come a long way, and they're much more readily available. I'm thinking about some of the mobile device management things that are out there now, especially because, let's face it, most of the connection that employees are having to their personal social media is on their smartphones or on their tablets. Some of it happens on the computer for sure, but more and more it's mobile. And so managing that used to be more of a nightmare. And these days it's getting easier and easier because there's these tools there's these mobile device management tools that allow employers to really create a good firewall between the personal and the work side of a device, and to track all that, and to secure all that.
I think that's really important to consider, especially when you have your bring your own device policy, tablet, mobile phone, whatever, that you do have a way to monitor and manage that, not necessarily just from the company desktop or laptop computer.
Exactly. And if you have something like that in place, if something untoward does happen, somebody takes secrets with them or blabs about the company in a bad way, if you have some sort of management tool like that on board, you're then able, it makes the investigation after the fact and the forensics after the fact much, much easier, because all that content is being stored, it's being tracked, it's manageable.
Let's kind of close with the final question. I know you and I had talked earlier about social media and terminations. I have a blog post which I'm updating that lists all the terminations that I'm finding on the internet is employees who say or do stupid things on social media and unfortunately lose their jobs as a result. What advice do you have for employers about maybe ways that they can keep those things from happening, or for employers to protect their personal brands or their company brands so they're not negatively in the news associated with something that an employee did on their off work time?
That's a tricky question, and it's especially tricky for someone like me who is, generally speaking, brought in after the fact, after something has already gone really south. I would say that the first step is building trust with folks, building a culture where, building an organizational culture where going online and complaining about the company or complaining about management is just not something that would happen. You're having a more professional interaction with your employees. A lot of it is the tone at the top. If you see your supervisors bad mouthing folks, you're probably going to be more likely to do the same. If you see some sort of embezzlement or some sort of skimming happening up above you, then folks lower down are more likely to do the same. So the tone at the top is really important. Building a culture of trust and professionalism is super important. But then I think, unfortunately, there is an element to that as well, just that makes it very clear that these are the policies, these are the protocols, this is what's in bounds, and this is what's out of bounds. And we have the tools that will make it very easy to show if someone was doing something that was out of bounds. So, it's a hard balance to strike for some HR professionals that I've worked with, that, you're trusting and you're open, but at the same time, you're very much on top of those controls and those specific things you can do to secure that digital environment.
Well, I say thank you for providing some introspection and some sort of information, because oftentimes in human resources, we don't see the small details that are very important and everything that is involved with the investigation and digital forensics that you are working on every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm happy to share my experience, which is not vast in this field, but it's enough to be able to say some of the things that I think are important. I'm happy to help out.
Well, where can people go to learn more about you?
My website, elirosenblatt.com. I have all kinds of information there about the different types of investigations that I do, or my Twitter feed. I just posted a couple things that were very relevant this morning about investigations into sexual harassment, and different types of investigations in different workplaces. So yeah, PDX Investigator is my handle on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to a couple of the resources listed on your website in the resources section of the podcast transcript, as well as your LinkedIn and your Twitter account, so people can get in touch with you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Sure. Thank you, Eli, for joining the Workology podcast today. And thank you for joining us. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. I'm your host, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, HR, and recruitment. Until next time, you can visit Blogging for Jobs to listen to all our previous Workology episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by Total Picture.